Hello everyone, I'm the Enforcer, and welcome to the breaking news. Please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and support us on Patreon, link in the description below. Breaking news today is that Ukrainian forces have apparently encircled the Russian army inside of Bakhmut, and the Russians are no longer able to retreat without taking incredibly high losses. This statement came from Nexta today, and according to Hanna Maylar, who is a higher up in the Ukrainian armed forces, the AFU in the Bakhmut area has already reached many dominant heights, so the Russian army is trapped there. They can't get out of Bakhmut, and they can't move fully around the city itself either, Mylar said. According to her, Ukrainian forces continue to slowly advance south of Bakhmut, having successes there. This is something we've been seeing developing for quite a while, and it appears that the Ukrainians are quite confident that the Russian forces inside of Bakhmut will be stuck there and will have no good way to retreat. At the moment, it appears that they are entirely correct in this assumption as well. The 77th Air Mobile Brigade has been holding down the western side of the city of Bakhmut and stopping any Russian forces from attempting a breakthrough through the center of the lines. Meanwhile, units like the 93rd Fighting Brigade, as well as the 3rd Brigade, have been continuously pushing on the southern front, along with artillery support from adjacent brigades, and in the northern areas, we've seen the K2 Battalion, among many other units, continuing the push in this direction. All of these pushes over about the past 2 to 3 months have managed to retake almost all of the major heights around the city of Bakhmut itself, except for the chicken tender and the hill line near Zaitseva. However, these hill lines are not pertinent or important at this phase in the battle. It is more so the ridgeline just to the northwest of Bakhmut and also to the southwest that are the most crucial for Ukrainian forces, and also the ones that are going to be sorely missed by the Russian army. Ukrainian forces now have the ability, due to their terrain advantage, to fire on to Russian forces entering the city of Bakhmut near to the chicken tender on the T-0504, and they also have complete and indomitable control over Krasnoora, northern Bakhmut, and the M03 highway as well, completely cutting Russian forces off from any easy access to the city, meaning that those forces will be very limited in their combat abilities and also less flexible on the battlefield in being able to respond to Ukrainian breakthroughs in the south or the north. This will most likely be a turning point as far as the Ukrainian announcement has gone by Hanna Maylar today in the battle. We'll probably see the Ukrainian forces begin to advance at a more steady pace, and we'll also see that the Russians will probably start to execute some kind of a small retreat from the city. We'll probably see them give up block by block each day until there's really nothing left for them to hold. The Battle of Bakhmut isn't about the city, at least as far as the battle itself is carried out. It is entirely about the hills and ridgelines that surround the city of Bakhmut, and whoever controls these hills and ridgelines largely is able to control the fate of the city itself, and it appears that the Ukrainians are certainly retaking that initiative, and Bakhmut may become Ukrainian here in the next several months, maybe by the end of this year or by the beginning of early next year. Moving on out of the city of Bakhmut and on up into Russia, we've also heard today that the Russians are now going on an offensive against the Wagner and are attempting to completely destroy it outright. According to a Russian official today, once again according to Nexta, PMC Wagner will cease to exist, according to Viktor Sobolev, and he also said that the fighters will be able to leave or sign a contract with the Ministry of Defense. Victor Bout then went on to say that this is an illegal armed formation. There should not be any armed people in the state who are not subordinate to the state. As a result, it led to a rebellion. We were on the verge of a civil war. And it appears that Viktor Sobolev today said a lot more than really anyone else has ever said about the Prigozhin coup up until this point. And we're seeing now the true feelings of the Russian government stated by Viktor Sobolev that they had this entire time after the coup. The Wagner coup was so serious in its implications that it truly almost led Russia to the brink of civil war. With thousands of Russian army units either standing out of the way of the Wagner and allowing them to move on forward or joining the Wagner, it was clear that the Wagner had a massive and unwavering amount of national support backing them up in this coup attempt. If they had made it to the city of Moscow itself, there's really no question they most likely would have been able to overthrow the Russian government at large. There wasn't really any defensive forces inside of Moscow. Most of them were paramilitary or police forces, and they wouldn't have posed that much of a threat to the heavily armed and incredibly powerful Wagner at that point. And we can now see that the Russians appear to have learned from this mistake, at least in this statement by Sobolev, as they're now saying that every single armed force within Russia needs to fall under the direct command of the Russian Federation and its government. It also appears that they are going to be not creating a PMC, at least for the foreseeable future, although this is going to start causing major problems as far as Russia's geopolitics or global diplomacy or global strategy goes, because now they don't have that somewhat disconnected right arm of the Russian government that the Wagner served that could be able to exert Russian influence on other parts of the world, like in Syria and also in Central Africa. If the Russians want to continue on their influence in this area, they're going to have to find new ways to do it, like bringing in the Russian military directly. But we really don't know how that will go or how successful it will be, considering that that was the large reason why the Wagner existed in the first place, is that the Russians didn't want to directly send Russian forces into those areas and create large amounts of diplomatic escalation with the West because of those actions. And so we'll be waiting to see how this goes with what is happening to the Wagner. But the Wagner is dead at this point. There has been no uprising from the Wagner either. We suspected that one would have happened around 72 hours ago, and it did not. And so we are assuming that the Wagner is now completely extinct. It is a thing of the past, another page in Russian history, one that'll be remembered for a while. The Wagner will be the beginning of the end as far as the Russians are concerned, and it's most likely going to be viewed like the 1905 Russian Revolution that was largely unsuccessful but paved the way for the more successful 1917 revolution to begin. That's most likely the historical context that this can be related to, but of course, we'll just have to wait and see as time goes by. Moving on out of Moscow and back into Ukraine, we've also heard some interesting news from the southern front near Robolny, where we've heard that apparently, according to the Institute for the Study of War, once again the Russians are using up their valuable and rare units to try and hold the front lines due to a lack of a strategic reserve. Today we heard that the 76th Air Mobile Brigade, and let me make sure that I got that correct. I'm sorry, it's not the Air Mobile Brigade, it's the Russian 76 Guards Air Assault Division, also known as the VDV, has been repositioned from the area of Kremenna down into the direction of Robolny. This is a move that the Russians had to make. It was a necessary one. The Ukrainians are currently breaking through in the area around Robolny, and they're making some steady advances on a daily basis. We can see some of those advances highlighted in dark blue here over the past 24 hours, and it appears that the Russians are starting to lose complete control over this part of the front line. Because of that, they're needing to bring in strategic reserves. Problem is, they don't really have any. So they've decided to take the 76th Brigade from the Kremenna area, once again the VDV, one of Russia's most elite units, and move it down into the area of Robolny in hopes that it will be able to plug the gap in the line and stop the Ukrainian advance. Whether it will or won't, we're not really sure yet. We'll have to wait and see. The VDV is not what it once was at the beginning of the war. Most of the original VDV soldiers at this point have been wounded or killed and removed from the unit, so the VDV, while being a quote-unquote elite unit for the Russian Federation, is still somewhat green due to the amount of reinforcements that's required and the lack of training that these reinforcements most likely endured. But still, it is showing that the Robolny situation is one that is very precarious, and it's once again reiterating that the Russians are teetering on the very precipice of defeat as far as the manpower situation goes. There is no manpower to work from. They're having to take units like the VDV to plug these gaps. In a normal war, you would see a regular infantry unit be moved up. You would see something like a 168th Motorized Rifle Brigade moved up. It's just another group of infantry, and it's a fresh group that has the same equipment that any other Motorized Rifle Brigade would have, and then it would fill the gap. But considering that they're taking the VDV and filling the gap with that, it's showing that they're having some major issues. And not only are they well trained, but the VDV is actually a bit of a lighter force than you would see other units comprised of. The VDV has less tanks, and also less APCs. It's a part of their force structure. Of course, the VDV is an airborne unit, so it's structured to be a far lighter and more lean unit as far as the armored vehicles go than really any other, and that is certainly not what the Russians need in this area right now. If they actually had the freedom to pick up any unit that they wanted to try and plug this gap with, it most likely would have been a motorized rifle brigade, or maybe even an armored brigade. Considering that that most likely would bring in the heavier firepower that the Russians would be looking for, that would probably be able to try and slow the Ukrainian advance just a small amount. But instead, they're bringing in entirely infantry, and this infantry will most likely be spotted by Ukrainian artillery and hit before they're even used. So we can see, of course, the Russians are having a very serious problem with manpower issues, and now that's starting to greatly affect their elite units, and their elite units are going to start paying the price quite dearly. Speaking of paying the price, we also saw in the area of Kazachi Lahri that the Russians have paid dearly for their blunder in this area. The Ukrainians have a firm foothold now, just north of Oleski and also in the village of Kazachi Lahri, and we saw today that they raised the Ukrainian flag over the village of Kazachi Lahri. And so, here's the clip.
Антонівський міст там десь, трошечки, це Андрюшка, я Іван, Богом даний.
You can see the Ukrainians are pretty proud of their accomplishment. We can see them looking around the village.
Що від нього осталося, блядь. Ну, так тут виглядає після потопу, після прильотів, обстрілів. Але ми тут знайшли, коротше, випадково.
We see him showing the flagpole that they're about to mount this flag onto. And we can also see that it still has the Ukrainian Triton on it. Great to see.
І вирішили, коротше, в нас випадково в Андрюхи в кармані опинився наш жовто-блакитний.
And here in a second, I'll skip forward just a little bit. We see them mounting the flag. And here before long, they will raise the flag.
Щось не то.
And when you hear them playing the Ukrainian anthem as they raise the flag, once again a sign to the Russians that they have a firm foothold on the southern side of the river, and this can be posing major problems for Russian forces in the future. But a great moment for sure, and a prideful one for Ukraine, considering that this is the first time the Ukrainian flag itself has been permanently raised on the southern side of the Dnipro River. We can also see this plushie. I don't know what the plushie was about, but he liked it, so you know, it's in the video. But that's largely the end of this clip, and it's very important to remember that this foothold on the southern end, both at Antonovsky here, well, more so Dachi, and also up here at Kazachi Lahri, is a very serious issue for the Russian army in this area. Of course, with less and less manpower available, the Russians have been trimming down their frontline force strength in most areas, including that of the southern Dnipro River and also towards the Kremenna and northeastern part of the front line, and they have been diverting most, if not all of them, to the Bakhmut area and also into Zaporizhia. Out of that breakdown, nearly 60 to 70% of them end up in Zaporizhia, the remainder end up in the area around Bakhmut. Because of that, Russian forces in the southern bank of the Dnipro River are weaker now than they ever have been, just by force size. And that means that the Ukrainians are now clearly showing that the Russians not only have a problem to be concerned with in Zaporizhia and also in Bakhmut, but they also have a serious problem to contend with in the Dnipro River area, considering that if the Ukrainians begin to capitalize on these successes and begin to flood a brigade or several brigades over the river and into this area, Russian forces will most likely be overwhelmed quite quickly, and the Ukrainians would create a strong foothold or a large landing area that further forces could be brought in and an offensive could be realized that would reach Crimea probably before any other offensive action in the war could at this point, especially the Zaporizhia front, which is still about 80 to 100 miles away from the Crimean border. The Kazachi Lahri area and the Antonovsky area or Dachi area is only around 30. It's far closer. Moving on from the area in the Dnipro River area and on down into Sochi, we also heard that President Erdogan of Turkey is still going all out in trying to make sure that the grain deal is reinitiated. Turkey was one of those recipients of Ukrainian grain before the grain deal was terminated, along with the People's Republic of China, also known as Communist China or Mainland China, as well as many other countries on top of that, including Saudi Arabia. There are some fairly large countries that had interests in Ukrainian grain, and it appears that Erdogan is going to be representing at least the Republic of Turkey when they return and they begin to discuss reopening a grain deal. This grain deal, or the discussion about the grain deal, will begin on September 4th in the city of Sochi, which held the Winter Olympics of 2014. According to what we know, and at this moment this is all we know, the discussion will most likely revolve around that grain deal. Not only is the grain deal beneficial for the Turks, it's beneficial, of course, for all of the other countries around the world and for Ukraine as well, as it's an economic lifeline for the Ukrainians to continue to be able to export their grain and also receive payment for it. It's money that wouldn't be coming in otherwise, and something that the Ukrainians will, of course, be eyeing to restart, and something that all of the countries that receive their grain will be eyeing to start as well, because that grain is very important to national growth and the continuation of national food security for most of these countries, especially ones such as the Saudi Arabians that don't have a lot of grain produced inside of their own country. Saudi Arabia being mostly a desert, they have to import almost all of their grains from other parts of the world, and Ukraine was one of their major providers. That could also start to pose problems in the future, but that's for an entirely different video, because that would be a massive, massive topic to cover, is what would happen if the Saudis started to have to pay premium prices for grains and basic foodstuffs. But with that, that is all of the major news we've had today. I've got to thank all of y'all so much once again for watching. If y'all did enjoy, please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. You can support us on Patreon in the link in the description below. It helps us to make video projects like this possible. And I thank every single one of y'all so much once again for watching. And with that, I will see you all in the next one.